What a great name for a father. Father Rocky, Executive Director of Relevant Radio. Father?
Momentarily on the screen, we're going to see our guest speaker this evening, Professor Robbie George. And if you've seen your booklet here, it lists all of his credentials. He teaches at Princeton. He went to Harvard. He studied at Oxford. Princeton, Harvard, and Oxford. These institutions are not known for their football teams, but these great universities and their scholars have an enormous impact on the expression of ideas that help to shape our contemporary American culture, for better or for worse. It's the rare intellectual who can claim affiliation with Princeton, Harvard, and Oxford, but this evening we're privileged to listen to one. And by his scholarship, he is helping to shape our culture for the better. Tonight we're truly blessed to be able to learn from Professor Robert George, the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University. The New York Times considers Dr. George to be, quote, this country's most influential conservative Christian thinker, end quote. Relevant Radio considers Professor George to be this country's most reasonable thinker. I always look forward to Professor George's contributions on Relevant Radio, and if I can't tune in here on 100.1 FM in Milwaukee or 1640. I'll listen to it later on the Relevant Radio app. Now, Dr. George is a reasonable thinker, and as such, he is a strong advocate for life, for marriage, for freedom, for commitment to family, hard work, private ownership, the rule of law, and non-governmental community initiatives such as Summit Educational Association, by which those who have been blessed give back to the community and help others on their journey. A true American and a patriot, ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Dr. Robert George.
Well, thank you so much, Father Rocky, for that very kind introduction. Is it possible for everyone to hear me? Okay. Let me begin by apologizing for not being there with you in person. I had been looking forward to this evening enormously and being there to help you to celebrate and to support Summit's extraordinarily important work for which I know I'm far from alone in expressing enormous gratitude. But I tried to get there, and the plane was actually on the runway when they called us back to the terminal to say that because of a weather problem, they were canceling 50 flights, one of which was ours. So here I am at home in Princeton, New Jersey, when I want to be there with you, but I'm glad that through the miracle of technology, I'm at least able to make a little contribution to this evening. Let me also say how much I want to join in congratulating Gus Ramirez for his contributions to disadvantaged youth. He's really an enormous, great example for all of us, and congratulations, Mr. Ramirez. Well, I want to talk with you this evening about markets, morality, and civil society. I want to talk to you about what I regard as the 5 pillars of decent and dynamic societies. My remarks will be familiar to some of my colleagues who are there because these are issues we talk about all the time. When I refer to my colleagues, I refer to my great Bradley Bradley Foundation colleagues. I know that Pat English is there with you this evening, so hello, Pat, and Diane Saylor, my great comrade on the staff at the Bradley Foundation. Now, the market economy, or what those of us associated with the Bradley Foundation and others sometimes call democratic capitalism, is, in my opinion, eminently defensive. The market economy cannot, however, be understood, much less defended, apart from considerations of integral human well-being, that is, moral considerations. Indeed, any effort and see them all the time, to de-link the market economy from moral considerations, to prescind from them making the case for the market economy, distorts our understanding of both markets and morals. The risk of that distortion is not, as I say, abstract or merely theoretical. In fact, the desire to separate economics from morality is rampant in our politics today, across the spectrum, by the way, left to right. That kind of attempted separation is in particular held up as a path to a so-called consensus or a middle ground. And I think that's a bad mistake. How often have you heard someone say, for example, let's leave behind those divisive social issues and just worry about getting the economy moving again? That's a sentiment that I hear all the time. And I think, again, it's profoundly misguided. I want to talk this evening about why it's impossible as well as undesirable to separate moral considerations from economic ones. We can see it why in a few distinct ways. The first way is the simplest, though perhaps the least instructive for our purposes here this evening. Simply put, economics cannot separate from morality because, frankly, nothing can be separated from morality. Everything we do as human beings, as human persons, as individuals, and societies should be understood, at least in part, in terms of the intelligible values, the human goods that our actions seek to advance. So to ask about our economic system, the means by which we build national wealth, allocate resources, address people's material needs, reward hard work and risk-taking, and so forth, can't possibly be separated from the deepest moral questions that we as a society face. But I want to focus here on two other respects that we as a society have to consider moral considerations in relation to the market economy, especially if we want to be, as we should want to remain a free society. One reason has to do with the nature of the system of free enterprise itself, and the other has to do with the nature of a free society. The economic system we today typically refer to as capitalism and characteristically distinguished from communism and other species of command economy is, of course, an economic system. But it's crucial to see that its roots, its very origins, have it at the same time as a moral system. Adam Smith, who we think of as perhaps the father of free market theory, was a moral philosopher. He didn't consider himself an economist. He considered himself a moral philosopher. And his economic system, as laid out in his great work, The Wealth of Nations, was intended as an element of a larger moral system, one that he had begun to set forth intellectually in his earlier work on the moral sentiments. And Smith understood the market system as essential to a free society and understood a free society as important for moral reasons. Smith believed that a free society required more than just rules that limit power and the scope and intrusiveness of government. More than just a system that secured people's rights, essential as those obviously are. A free society required, above all, men and women fit, morally fit, for freedom. And that's an achievement. Not everyone has fit themselves out for freedom. People who are criminals, people who lack self-control, people who steal, who cheat, or who lie, have constituted themselves as characters who are not fit for freedom. They can't be trusted because of their personal vices. Our system relies on most of us, most of the time, doing the right thing for the right reason and not out of fear of punishment, not out of fear of the coercive power of government being brought down on us. Our society has a deep interest in most of us, at least, all of us ideally, but most of us at least, truly having good character, having the kind of character that makes us fit for freedom. What Smith meant by people fit for freedom was people who have the right kind of moral formation, the moral formation that enables them to be trusted with what frankly is an enormous amount of liberty and choice. By historic standards, the market economy leaves people with an enormous amount of liberty. But to exercise that liberty responsibly, people need to be the sort of people, they need to have the strength of moral character, the virtues, to respect the rights of others, live orderly, peaceful lives, exercise reasonable, sound judgment, bring up their children responsibly, and generally be reliable, honest, charitable, in a word, decent. We think of these kinds of virtues as democratic virtues. Sometimes people refer to them as the bourgeois virtues. And Smith argued, I think completely rightly, that these virtues are essential to life in a free society. Now, Adam Smith's idea of liberty, which is of course central to his case for the market economy, was not unbridled license, but rather ordered liberty, ordered social life, a social life in which the people's basic rights are protected as well as respected by the government, and the people's self-discipline and respect for each other's dignity and rights limits the need for the coercive power of the state to be used all the time to keep people in line. It doesn't eliminate the need for the coercive power of the state. It doesn't make it possible for us to abolish the criminal law, but it does enable us to have an orderly society without the law being too heavy-handed, too intrusive, too powerful a force over people's lives and choices. The market system that Smith envisioned in his economic writings is made possible by this kind of social order, but it also acts to reinforce that order and, very importantly now, to strengthen it. Smith believed the market economy, the market-based commercial society he contemplated, would be a good society, and he thought so for several reasons. To begin with, he argued, the generation and preservation of wealth is necessary for a good society because it reduces the misery of the poor, and it allows everyone to be more sympathetic and generous. I'll quote him now. If our own misery pinches us very severely, he argued, we have no leisure to attend to that of our neighbor, unquote. But at least as important, the market is not just a mechanism for wealth production, but it's also a civilizing institution. It makes human relations more dignified. Smith argued that the market system of exchange, as opposed to the feudal system of owner and tenant, or the Southern European system of patron and client, the alternative systems to the market system, allows even the less privileged to address society in terms of what they have to offer, as workers, for example, rather than what they need. The dignity of work helps us to see the dignity of people, all people. The fundamentally popular or democratic character of the system he proposed was also an important moral point for Smith. I quote him again, no society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable, unquote. So his system would allow those who lived off wages, not property, to benefit more than any other economic arrangement could. And it would, as Lincoln would later note, enable those who initially live off wages to at least have the possibility of themselves developing capital, owning property. A society could become not only a democracy, but a property-owning democracy. And they, in turn, as property owners, and especially as business owners, could employ others who, as Lincoln noted, would then be wage earners who through thrift, through savings, through hard work, could develop property, perhaps become businessmen and women themselves. And finally, the commercial society would encourage people to behave responsibly. Market players have a powerful incentive to consider what others will think of their actions, since they have to appeal to those others as employers, employees, or customers. That doesn't work perfectly, of course. It doesn't mean that anybody who's in business is going to do the right thing. Sometimes, in fact, People who are in business will do the wrong thing because they fear doing the right thing when it's unpopular. Still, the virtues most valued in sellers and buyers are the moderate virtues, virtues essential to life in a free society: prudence and thrift, honesty and reliability, civility and good order. Once again, those crucial democratic and bourgeois virtues. The maintenance of the market system, as Smith saw it, is made possible by these virtues, and it also acts to reinforce them, provided, of course, that it's governed and regulated with these aims in mind. And there's a role there for government. It demands and rewards habits of peaceful order and can spread these into the larger society. The market economy, at its best, can therefore promote prosperity and compassion, dignity and fellow feeling, and a sense of responsibility. Properly conceived and regulated, it makes for a suitable companion for the free society precisely on moral grounds. Now, to see why that may be right, we should turn to the second and deeper case for the moral character of our market economic system, which is a case about the character of our free society and the preconditions for its freedom. And here's where I'll go into those pillars of decent and dynamic societies that I referred to. Any healthy society, any decent society, whether or not it's democratic, will rest upon three crucial pillars. The first is respect for the human person, the individual human being and his dignity. Where this pillar is in place, the formal and informal institutions of society and the beliefs and practices of the people will be such that every member of the human family, irrespective of race, sex, ethnicity, age, size, stage of development, or condition of dependency, is treated as a person, that is, as a subject bearing profound, inherent, and equal worth and dignity. A society that does not nurture respect for the human person will sooner or later, probably sooner rather than later, come to regard human beings as mere cogs in the social wheel, the larger social wheel, cogs whose dignity and well-being may legitimately be sacrificed for the sake of the collectivity. We saw this in the old Soviet Union, in the Soviet satellite states, and in Pol Pot's Cambodia, and in Idi Amin's regime, and so forth and so on. Some members of the community, or those in some conditions, will come to be regarded as disposable, and others, those in severe circumstances of dependency, for example, will come to be viewed as intolerably burdensome, what the Nazis called useless eaters, in justifying their eugenics program. A program, by the way, that was not invented by the Nazis, but taken over by them, having been invented by the Weimar era progressives, by the liberals of the day. And the eugenics movement was popular, exceedingly popular, not only among German progressives or European progressives, but I very much regret to say among American progressives as well, in justifying a case of the mandatory sterilization of a woman under a Virginia law in the 1930s. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, believing that the woman was mentally unfit, famously declared, "3 generations of imbeciles is enough," a black mark on Holmes's record, as well as the record of the Supreme Court on which he served, and of which he was in the majority in that case. But that eugenics mentality was indeed wildly popular and is returning today. In its most extreme forms, totalitarian regimes reduce the individual, whether they're the left or the right, whether they're the fascist sort or the communist sort, reduce the individual to the status of an instrument to serve the ends of the fascist state or the future communist utopia or what have you. When liberal democratic regimes go awry, it's often because a utilitarian ethic reduces the human person to a means, rather than an end to which other things, including the systems and institutions of law and education and the economy, are means. In cultures in which religious fanaticism has taken hold, and we know all about this Today, in virtue of what we see in some of the worst offending regimes in the world, whether we're talking about Iran or Saudi Arabia or now ISIS, which is functioning as a government in parts of Iraq and Syria, wherever religious fanaticism has taken hold, the dignity of the individual is typically sacrificed for the sake of a tragically misbegotten theological set of ideas and goals. Now, of course, the same things happen in the name of secular ideologies, whether it is the communist ideology of North Korea or China, or whether it is even the liberal democratic ideology that falls victim to utilitarianism and embraces something like eugenics. Now, by contrast, a liberal democratic ethos where it is uncorrupted by utilitarianism, by the reduction of human beings to mere means, supports the dignity of the human person by giving witness to basic human rights and liberties. And as we've seen, the market system at its best serves this goal too by dignifying work and by enabling our charitable impulses, enabling us to have something that we can give, contributing not only to the common good by way of taxation, for example, but also, in other words, paying our fair share, but also giving charitably, paying for the relief, the help of others, those who are in need. Now, the second pillar of any decent society is the institution of the family, the marriage-based family, and it is indispensable. The family, you see, is the original and best and irreplaceable Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Although no family is perfect, no institution matches the healthy family in its capacity to transmit to each new generation the understandings and traits of character, the values and virtues upon which the success of every other institution in society, from law and government to educational institutions and business firms, vitally depends. Where families fail to form, or where families disintegrate on a massive scale, the effective transmission of the virtues of honesty, civility, self-restraint, concern for the welfare of others, justice, compassion, and personal responsibility is obviously imperiled, to say the least. And without these virtues, respect for the dignity of the human person, that first pillar of a decent society, will be undermined, and sooner or later, again, probably sooner rather than later, it will be lost. For even the most laudable formal institutions, constitutional structures, cannot uphold respect for human dignity where people do not have the virtues that make that respect a reality and give it vitality in actual social practices. We have an excellent Constitution, the best. Our founders bequeathed us a magnificent system of government. We stray from it far too often, but it's a great system. But even if we lived perfectly under it, as Madison, for example, himself noted, it would still not work unless there was some virtue in the people. And that virtue in the people is not produced by the Constitution itself. It's not produced by the government. It's not produced by the legal system. It's not even produced by the economy. It's produced, if it is to be produced at all, by the family, by the marriage-based family, by moms and dads bringing up kids and bringing them up to respect themselves and each other, and to respect others as full, equal persons. Now, respect for the dignity of the human being requires more than formally sound institutions, then. It requires a cultural ethos in which people act from conviction to treat others as human beings should be treated, with respect, civility, justice, compassion. As I say, the best legal and political institutions ever devised are really just useless, where selfishness, contempt for others, dishonesty, injustice and other types of immorality and irresponsibility flourish. Indeed, the effective working of governmental institutions themselves depends upon most people, most of the time, obeying the law out of a sense of moral obligation and not merely out of fear of detection and punishment for lawbreaking. And perhaps it goes without saying that the success of business and a market-based economic system depends on there being reasonably virtuous, trustworthy, law-abiding, promise-keeping people, at least enough of them to serve as workers and managers, lenders, regulators, payers of bills for goods and services. Now, the third pillar of any decent society is a fair and effective system of law and government. Limited government, but as we say at the Bradley Foundation, competent limited government. This is necessary because none of us is perfectly virtuous all the time, and some people, alas, will be deterred from wrongdoing only by the threat of punishment. More importantly, contemporary philosophers of law tell us the law coordinates human behavior for the sake of achieving common goals, the common good, especially in dealing with the complexities of modern life, everything from complex traffic regulation to the tax code. Even if all of us were perfectly virtuous all of the time, we would still need a system of laws considered as authoritatively stipulated coordination norms to accomplish many of our common ends. For example, safely transporting ourselves on the streets and highways. Let's just take an obvious example. The success of business firms and the economy as a whole depends vitally on a fair and effective system and set of institutions for the administration of justice. We need judges skilled in the craft of law, free of corruption, and disciplined enough, and here we're lacking today, disciplined enough to respect the limits of their own authority in the constitutional system. We need to be able to rely on courts to apply legal rules and principles faithfully to settle disputes, including those disputes that are between parties who are both in good faith but happen to disagree, and to enforce contracts and other agreements and do it in a timely manner. Indeed, the knowledge that contracts will be enforced by the courts if people break them or try to evade their responsibilities under them is usually sufficient to ensure that courts will actually not be called on to enforce contracts. Most contracts that people form are completed, the deal's done, people do what they're supposed to do under the contract without the courts getting involved. And part of the reason that that works so well is that when the courts do need to get involved, courts are there to do their jobs. If you look at some countries, especially in the third world, where the judicial system is deeply corrupt or it's not functioning, you see that that's no place that people can do business because they can't rely on the promises that others make. They can't rely on contracts, people fulfilling their contractual obligations. And who suffers? Not just the parties who'd like to enter into a contract, but of course everyone, because of the damage done to the overall economy by the lack of an enforcement system to make it possible for people confidently to enter into contractual relationships and do business. A sociological fact of which we can be certain is this: where there is no reliable system of the administration of justice, no confidence that courts will hold people to their obligations under the law, business will not flourish, and everyone in the society will suffer. Now, a society can, in my opinion, be a decent one even if it's not a democratic one, and even if it's not a dynamic one, if the three pillars are healthy and functioning in a mutually supportive way, as they will if each is actually healthy. Now, conservatives of a certain stripe believe that a truly decent society cannot be a dynamic one. Dynamism, they believe, causes instability, and that undermines the pillars of decency. So some conservatives, especially in Europe, but even in the United States, have opposed not only industrialism, but the very idea of a commercial society, fearing that commercial economies inevitably produce consumerist and acquisitive materialist attitudes that corrode the foundations of decency, that undermine virtue. And some, such as Amish communities here in the United States, at least the more fundamentalist ones, reject even education for their children beyond what's necessary to master reading, writing, and arithmetic on the ground that further education leads to worldliness and apostasy and undermines religious faith and moral virtue. There's a great constitutional case on this subject that came out of Wisconsin called Yoder against Wisconsin. Now, although a decent society need not be a dynamic one, as the Amish example shows, Amish people are entirely decent. Their society is decent, but they deliberately exclude dynamism. In my opinion, dynamism need not erode decency. And, as we've seen Adam Smith suggested, it can actually support and reinforce decency. A dynamic society need not be one in which consumerism and materialism become rife and in which moral and spiritual values disappear. Indeed, dynamism can play a positive moral role, and I would venture to say will do so in circumstances in which people take seriously and attend to the need to create a virtuous citizenry, a citizenry that is fit for freedom. Now, dynamism is sustained by two sets of institutions in particular. First, institutions of research and education in which the frontiers of knowledge across the humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences are pushed back, and through which knowledge is transmitted to students and disseminated to the public at large, schools and universities and so forth. And second, business firms in a fundamentally free and competitive market, and associated institutions supporting them or managed in ways that are at least in some respects patterned on their principles, by which wealth is generated, widely distributed, and preserved. We can therefore think of universities and business firms, along with respect for the dignity of the human person, the institution of the marriage-based family, and the system of law and government, as the five pillars of decent and dynamic societies. The university and the business firm depend in various ways for their well-being on the well-being of others, and they can help to support them in turn. At the same time, of course, ideologies and practices that are hostile to the pillars of a decent society can manifest themselves in higher education, and they do that all the time now, and in business, and they do that all the time now. And these institutions can then erode the social values, the social capital, on which they themselves depend, not only for their own integrity, but for their long-term survival. I believe it was Lenin. I'll bet Diane Saylor can correct me if I'm wrong about this. I believe it was Lenin. It might have been Engels, but I believe it was Lenin who said that the communists would buy from the capitalists the rope that they will use to hang them. It's possible for business concerns to play into the hands of those who would undermine business by supposing that business has no stake in the question of the virtue of the people. Now, it's all too easy to take these pillars of decency and dynamism for granted. So it's important to remember that each of them has come under attack from different angles and different forces. Operating from within universities, persons and movements hostile to one or another of these pillars, usually preaching or acting in the name of high ideals of one sort or another, have gone on the attack. Attacks on business and the very idea of the market economy and economic freedom coming from the academic world are, of course, well known, and they are unabated. Students are sometimes taught, often taught, to hold business and especially businessmen in contempt as heartless exploiters driven by greed. In my own days as a student, these attacks were often made explicitly in the name of Marxism. One notices less of that today after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, but the attacks themselves have abated little, and we're now back at the point where people will appeal to the doctrines of socialism, to defend them. That's a relatively new development in our politics. Now, needless to say, where business people behave unethically, they play into the hands, into the stereotypes of the enemies of the market system and facilitate their effort to smear all business and the free market itself for the sake of transferring greater control of the economy to the government, the command economy idea. Similarly, attacks on the family, and particularly on the institution of marriage, have been common in the academy. The line here is that the family, at least as traditionally constituted and understood, is a patriarchal and exploitative institution that oppresses women and imposes on people forms of sexual restraint that are psychologically damaging and inhibiting of the free expression of their personality. Now, some will counsel that commercial business and businesses and business people have no horse in this race. They will say that these are moral, cultural, and religious disputes about which business people and people concerned with economic freedom need not concern themselves. These are the kinds of people who say, let's just lay aside those divisive moral issues and get on with the business of money making and economic growth. But this strikes me as so fundamentally wrong. I think that there's a reason that hard left movements such as Leninism that seek to undermine the market-based economic system and replace it with statist control of vast areas of economic life, also, at the same time, seek to weaken and instrumentalize the family, reducing marriage to a contract and transferring important elements of traditional parental roles and authority to the state or its instrumentalities. They perceive a link between the market and the family, and I think they're right to perceive that link, however much I believe they're wrong to seek to undermine these institutions and shift power from them to the central state. In my view, the weakening of the family imposes costs that are counted in ruined relationships, damaged lives, and all that follows in the social sphere from these personal catastrophes. In many poorer places in the United States, and I believe this is true many other countries as well, families are simply failing to form, and marriage is disappearing or coming to be regarded as an optional lifestyle choice, one among various optional ways of conducting relationships and having and rearing children. Especially alarming are situations in which marriage is disappearing among working class and poorer people, even though in some ways it's continuing to flourish among the wealthy, reinforcing their good condition of life, even as those lower down on the socioeconomic ladder sink further. Out of wedlock birth rates are very high in the United States, shockingly high, with the negative consequences being borne again not by the affluent so much, but rather by those in the poorest and most vulnerable sectors of society. In 1965, 50 years ago, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, then a youthful Harvard professor who was working in the administration of President Lyndon Johnson, a liberal democratic administration, as it was launching its Great Society initiatives, shocked the American people by reporting findings that the out-of-wedlock birth rate among African Americans in the United States had reached nearly 25%. Moynihan, liberal and a Democrat, warned that the phenomenon of boys and girls being raised without fathers in poorer communities would result in social pathologies that would severely harm those most in need of the supports of solid family life. He knew that there would be some who would survive. There would be heroic parenting by some mothers. Some children would make it, but he could see from the data that the overall trend would be catastrophic. And his predictions, all of them, were all too quickly confirmed. The widespread failure of family formation portended disastrous social consequences of delinquency and despair, violence, drug abuse, crime, and incarceration. A snowball effect resulted in the further growth of the out-of-wedlock birth rate. It's now over 70% among African Americans. It's worth noting that at the time of Moynihan's report, the out-of-wedlock birth rate for the population as a whole was under 6%, around 5%. Today, that rate, the out-of-wedlock birth rate for the population as a whole, is over 40%. Moynihan was ringing the alarm bell when the rate had reached 25% in one particular historically oppressed, comparatively poorer sector of our society. Now it's 40% for society as a whole, and growing. The economic consequences of these developments are very clear. Consider the need of business to have available to it a responsible and capable workforce. Business cannot manufacture honest, hardworking people to employ. You can't order them the way you order steel products or springs or plastics. Nor can government order them to exist by legal edicts. Business and government depend on there being many such people fit for freedom, but they must rely on the family, assisted by religious communities and other institutions of civil society, what Burke called the little platoons, to produce people fit for freedom. So business has a stake, a massive stake. Anyone interested in the free market economy has a stake, a massive stake, in the long-term health of the family. So too does the political order. Business and government should do nothing. They should avoid doing anything that has an effect of undermining the family, and these institutions should do whatever they can to strengthen the family. Now, as an advocate of dynamic societies, I believe in the market economy and the free enterprise system. I particularly value the social mobility and that economic dynamism makes possible. Indeed, I'm a beneficiary of that social mobility. A bit over 100 years ago, my own immigrant grandfathers, one from southern Italy and one from Syria, were coal miners. Here, I was going to say here in Appalachia because that's where I grew up. I'm actually in Princeton at the moment, but coal miners in Appalachia. Neither had so much as remotely considered the possibility of attending a university. As a practical economic matter, such a thing was out of the question. Now, at that time, Woodrow Wilson, the future president of the United States, was the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton. Today, just 2 generations forward, I, the grandson of those immigrant coal miners, am the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton. Now, I'm saying this not to brag or say there's anything important about me. That's not the point. What's remarkable about the story I just told you of immigrant people coming over and then in 2 generations, someone sitting in Woodrow Wilson's chair at Princeton University, what's remarkable about that is how unremarkable that story is. In fact, it's completely unremarkable. Thousands upon thousands of Americans can tell a similar story, and millions of Americans can tell a story something like that. Something like that story is the story of America. Now, it should go without saying that this kind of upward social and economic mobility is not so common in corporatist or socialist economic systems, but it is very common in market-based free enterprise economies. Now, having said that, I want to note that I'm not an advocate of the so-called laissez-faire doctrine that's embraced by strict libertarians. I believe that law and government do have important and indeed indispensable roles to play in regulating enterprises for the sake of protecting public health, safety, and morals, preventing exploitation and abuse, and promoting fair, competitive circumstances of exchange. I know from the stories my grandfathers tell of how coal miners were exploited and the importance of regulations that were put into place starting in the 1930s and 40s, largely as a result of pressure from the unions, to protect them against the hazardous conditions of coal mining. Coal mining continues to be a very hazardous occupation, but it is not as hazardous as it was in those days. And technology, the market, has a lot to do with how that came to be, but so does a role for government, a role that government played. But these roles are compatible, just as Adam Smith suggested, with the ideal of limited government and the principle of subsidiarity, according to which government must respect individual initiative to the extent reasonably possible and avoid violating the autonomy and usurping the authority of families, religious communities, and other institutions of civil society, the institutions that play and must play the primary role in building character and transmitting virtues, in making people who are fit for freedom, economic freedom, political freedom. Having said that, though, I would warn that limited government, considered as an ideal as vital to business as to the family, cannot be maintained where the culture collapses and families disintegrate, because where these things happen, the health, education, and welfare functions of the family will have to be undertaken by somebody or some institution, and sooner or later that is going to be the government. The government will do it badly because it can't do it well, but someone will have to do it, and it will be the government. As a result of that, of course, the tax burden will grow, the regulatory burden will grow, the cost of policing and incarceration will grow, and the ideal of limited government will fade still further. To deal with social problems that arise because of the collapse of civil society, bureaucracies, of course, will have to grow. So if we want limited government, as we should, and a level of taxation that is not unduly burdensome, which we should, we cannot do without healthy institutions of civil society, families, churches, civic associations, beginning with a flourishing marriage culture, supporting family formation and family preservation. So advocates of the market economy and supporters of marriage, family, and traditional virtues, from honesty to chastity, therefore have many common aims and many common adversaries. But their union is not and must not be regarded as a mere marriage of convenience. People sometimes conceive the alliance of free market economic people and people interested in moral issues as a marriage of convenience, but it mustn't be. The reason they have common adversaries is that they have common principles, namely respect for the human person, which grounds our commitment to individual liberty and the right to economic freedom and other essential civil liberties, belief in personal responsibility, which is a precondition of the possibility and the moral desirability of individual liberty in any domain, economic, civil, political, recognition of subsidiarity as the basis for effective but truly limited government, competent limited government, and for the integrity of the institutions of civil society that mediate, as my friend Professor Mary Ann Glendon of the Harvard Law School puts it, mediate between the individual and the centralized power of the state, respect for the rule of law, and recognition for the vital role played by the family and by religious institutions that support the character-forming functions of the family in the flourishing of any decent and dynamic society. My friends, the two greatest institutions ever devised for lifting people out of poverty and enabling people to live in dignity are the properly regulated market economy and the institution of marriage and the family. I believe that these institutions will, in the end, stand or fall together. Those who doubt their fundamental goodness or effectiveness and who wish to transfer more power over the economy and child rearing to the state seem fully to understand the connection between the two. My plea to people who share my own view that these institutions need to be strengthened, not weakened, and that state power should be lessened a bit rather than further expanded, should see the connection no less clearly. We should understand the moral dimension of our economic debates and of our economic system and work to establish and preserve a prosperous, dynamic, and virtuous society. Thank you very much for your kind attention. And again, I'm so sorry not to be with you there in person this evening, but congratulations to Summit.